Hello, welcome to the Amazon Community Day Bay Area in September 2024. Uh, Today I'll be talking about lessons from the trenches and sharing stories from my time at small startups over the last several years. My name is Carlo Mencarelli, and first we'll introduce myself a little bit. I'm a staff engineer at HackerOne. I've been there about 2.5 years now. Currently, I lead the infrastructure team in the organization. I also am an Amazon community builder. I've been a part of that program for 3 years now. I got my start around 12 years ago working in a government defense contractor for the FAA. They weren't using Amazon, but they ran their own private cloud that spanned the entire US. At that job, I worked everything from data center work to the NOx and SOX, application development, operations, every layer of the OSI stack, and then some. At some point, I landed a job at a small startup that used Amazon, and I have not looked back since. Now that we got that out of the way, let's talk about why we're here. We all want to learn, and one of my favorite ways to learn is to learn by making mistakes. But those are pretty expensive, and management, your customer teams, your customers don't really like it when you make those. So the next best thing is learning from other people's mistakes. Today, we'll look at three scenarios. What happens when you don't stay up to date on your releases, whether it's Apache, Kubernetes, Amazon services, anything really. Uh, why you should be taking your time to consider your existing architecture and whether it's still the best approach. And then finally, we'll end on determining when you're at good enough and what does that mean. So first, we'll get started with a story that could happen to any one of us. Once I worked at a small fintech startup, and we used KMS extensively. Each customer had several different customer managed keys in KMS, and this was partially for compliance reasons, but it was much, much easier to sell to banks and other financial orgs if you could say your data is encrypted with a key that only is used by the system and only used for your data. The fintech I worked at processed terabytes of data per day. Some small percentage of this ended up in a data lake that we started building out with Glue and S3 shortly after I joined the company. The company was expanding a lot, so it wasn't really surprising one day when I got a Slack message from the finance team asking about the Amazon bill. I assumed it was natural growth. They didn't sound too concerned, so I slotted some time in the next sprint that was coming up to take a look at it and see, where could we save some money. A few days later, a peer of mine, data engineer, serverless engineer, reached out and said, hey, Carlo, we have a problem. We're getting rate limited for KMS in our account. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but the KMS rate limits are extremely high. So for us to be hitting it, something had to have been wrong. And for our environment, where we're using KMS for almost every single operation, things like batch processing of data from banks, message queuing, payments for our customers, KMS being blocked at the service level was extremely problematic. The investigation was honestly very, very fast. We were able to track it down to a job that ran in our data warehouse. We were using QuickSight backed by Spice at the time, and every hour the Spice data set refreshed. During this refresh, it went through the S3 buckets that backed the data set and refreshed all the data. This led to millions and millions of requests per minute tagged as cryptographic operations symmetric in CloudWatch, or plainly put, encrypts, decrypts, data key generations, things like that. So turns out we had been slowly ramping up our data warehouse, and we finally got to consuming some of the larger data sets. And as the data made its way into S3, we're encrypting it with those CMKs. This was early 2021. There was only 5 or 6 of us on the team at the time. We supported an engineering organization of over 150 with just a couple of us on the infrastructure team. We didn't really have a lot of time to spare. In fact, we spent most of our time supporting the development and feature requests for other teams. We definitely didn't have time to pay attention to changes in our existing resources or consider announcements, say, from reInvent that happened a few months before. One of those releases was something called bucket keys. And what a bucket key is instead of using an individual KMS key, S3 will use a KMS key to generate a data key. This dramatically reduces the number of time that the original key is called, which means many less cryptographic operations. The implementation of bucket keys was trivial. So trivial, in fact, that we rolled it out across our entire platform in an afternoon. And we resolved the issue, the rate limiting immediately. We were able to see the prices, the cost dropped off immediately, and we went back to finance and told them we solved the problem. So, fun story. What might I do differently if I could go back in time? Frankly, a whole lot of things. Specifically around this, I check those release blogs, whether it's just to browse headlines, seeing if there's something that's relevant or interesting. If you even want to make it easier on yourself, you can set up a bot to aggregate these updates into Slack or Discord. With Slack, it's as easy as slash feed and then the feed URL. Very, very easy. There's no excuse nowadays to not have something like this. Amazon releases a lot. There's a lot of releases for other projects that I use things like Renovate. A lot of those honestly are not impacting me at all. I don't care about them, in fact. But occasionally I'll come across something that brings up a new perspective and it helps me move forward, uh, whether with my own career, my own personal learnings, or my company that I'm working for. Even better than reading and thinking about these announcements to yourself is to do it with others. Chat about that announcement that you're thinking is interesting with your team. I can't tell you how many times a teammate of mine brought up a change in GitLab or Kubernetes or whatever that I just kind of ignored or maybe even missed just because it's a lot of data. And that change ended up being really helpful. Doing this kind of thing also helps you digest the announcements even further. That new EBS feature that you're really excited about from reInvent, is that really actually relevant for you? Does it make a difference? After talking to your team, maybe you find out that the payout is really less than what you were excited about. A natural evolution to this practice is also making sure you take some time to experiment with new features or services to expand your understanding. It might not have a direct impact on your business today, but weeks or months, maybe even years in some cases in the future, it could. And for any team leads or managers out there, you should be responsible for advocating for your teams to do this. Encourage your team to do this. Make space with your peers and your leadership to ensure they have the space to do this. Next, we're going to move back a little further to the first startup I worked for. Coming in with a whole lot of enterprise experience and very little Amazon experience, I think I wasn't quite sure what typical cloud design patterns looked like at the time, but I do think I had a pretty good gut instinct for what architecture should look like. This startup was a smaller one. It used Ruby on Rails and had been in Amazon for several years at that point. They provided their customers with a combination of a CRM, CMS, donation platform, blog, mailing, kind of a whole platform for these users to use for advocacy. Their customers were global companies spanning from a few dozen employees to tens of thousands of employees across the globe. This startup also advertised and had a really strong sense of data privacy and ownership. So I as a customer, corporation, could go and download my entire database from this customer and stand it up on my own infrastructure and dig through the data that I had that this company was storing for me. The data was stored across 14 Postgres databases that ran on EC2. Each one of these databases had a hot standby that we wrote wall logs to, but really used in any type of replica or read-only sense. The instances themselves were R5 2XLs, and each came with about a terabyte of volume space, GP2 volumes. Not only was the monthly cost, financial cost enormous, the maintenance upkeep was frankly impossible to keep up with. The team spent hours every week ensuring that the databases were patched, vacuums were running, OSs were patched, wall logs were being written properly, replication was happening. The manager of that team frequently reached out and asked the team, why weren't we making progress on projects that we had planned or issues we said we were going to work on. The team never considered changing architecture. It was just a fact of life. We needed 14 Postgres databases. There's no question about it. We did our maintenance work on each instance every week, and we tried to make a little progress on other things we had in flight. The pain wasn't only felt on the infrastructure side. Product engineering had trouble too. Active Record, the de facto ORM for Rails, had to manage a lot with various connections, database migrations that would go out a couple times a week, locks piling up due to reading across databases. It was not a very good experience for the engineering department. When discussing long-term planning with the VP of engineering one day, she had stopped the meeting and asked the team, what is the biggest fire for the team right now? It was unanimous, the databases. No one had any suggestions on what to do about that fire, though. Shortly after that, a week or two, I was working on a replication failure with another engineer, and we started talking about how nice would it be to only have one database instead. We naturally came to the question of why not? Together, we started mapping out what would a move to a managed database service look like. Would it be RDS? Would it be Aurora? Would it be something else? How would we manage it? What would the load look like? What would the application changes be? We were doing this on the side, so the process took weeks, but it's okay. It was kind of a nice cathartic uh, experience for us. We did some load tests on just plain old RDS and Aurora with a small Rails app that we spun up. We found what the upper limit was with regards to various instance sizes. How many schemas could we load up on each instance size? We also started to look at what the migration looked like. When it came time to bring up the plan to the team, we had plenty of evidence showing why this was a good idea. It would save money, both directly and through labor. It would increase performance on the application servers, and it would dramatically simplify our architecture. There is natural debate, of course. We've never done it this way before. There is no way this could work. It's just too much work to do. The other engineer and I held strong on our opinion. We followed advice of other engineers and did, more testing, gathered more evidence. We reached out to our Amazon team to have an outside perspective, which helped immensely. While we didn't end up actually convincing a lot of the naysayers, we did convince the decision makers who did bless our plan. We moved forward, and at the end of the day, with some automation, bash scripts, we moved each schema using PG Logical one by one. Uh, the work was trivial, and it took just over a week to do with constant replication. We ended up saving around 60% in costs month to month. It was tens of thousands of dollars per year. We didn't need to worry about replica nodes anymore or patching OS, anything to do with OS, honestly. Even the updates between Postgres versions became much more trivial thanks to Amazon handling most of the heavy lifting behind the scenes. Everyone was happier on the team, and we were able to move on to bigger projects like a CDN migration or moving to a true multi-region platform. So, what stood out with that story? We didn't really have a failure in that story, but what we saw was the result of a failure. What happens when you coast on the momentum of your past decisions? We saw what it was like to not have an environment conducive to experimentation and change. You can foster this environment even if you're not a manager. If you're a senior engineer, lead by example. Make sure you give space to that junior engineer, though, to evaluate their own solutions. If you are that junior engineer, ask questions about different approaches. Why might not fewer databases work? And if you're a manager or leader in the space, make sure you give your team's time to experiment, just like we talked about in the last story. Let your engineer toy with that time series database. Even if the app doesn't really need one, it expands their way of thinking and lets connections form in new ways for problem solving. The other engineer and I had been other places, much larger places, and none of them had so many databases or as few customers. It felt like we were doing things the hard way for some odd throwback to the old days. Once we started questioning it and working through the problem, it really did seem as insurmountable as it was made out to be. Other engineers started to come around too. It wasn't all naysayers. Soon, we ended up changing process for the engineering org, and we had an entire database of architecture decisions. We were able to say why we chose Redis over Memcache, and this is what we gained. This is what we lost out on. And even better, we would revisit decisions sometime later and reevaluate them. Software evolves. The decision you made a year ago might not be the same one you would have made today. I fully believe that if we hadn't questioned the architecture and stayed firm when advocating for a new design, that data would still be spread across 14 databases all these years later. We truly believed in our solution and advocated for it at every opportunity. And last story, I promise. This time we're jumping closer to the present. I've moved on to HackerOne, which we covered before. Uh, HackerOne is a FedRAMP LiSaaS, or low impact software as a service provider. That lets us sell to government agencies, which require a little bit more compliance paperwork. We also use containers at HackerOne. Not for everything just yet. As of September 2024, we're still on the journey. But as a part of our FedRAMP requirements, we had to implement robust vulnerability scanning systems for our containers. If you haven't worked with FedRAMP before, I can tell you that the guidance is a little weird. Sometimes it's extremely explicit, as is the case with which type of two-factor authentications you can use. Other times it's a vague six-page memo. Last year, we started looking at a couple different ways to do vulnerability scanning. What would we need? How to implement it? And we had several different proposals, each one's with different levels of cost, effort, maintenance. We submitted the plan, which we thought would be best for the team and the company. That got approved. It went up to our FedRAMP partners. They gave it the okay, and then it went to our auditor, and they gave it an okay. We scheduled an audit for a few months in the future, so we had plenty of time to implement. We quickly ran into roadblocks, technical roadblocks. Nothing honestly impossible to solve, but enough that we took some time and pause. Conveniently enough, our distributed team was meeting in San Francisco for a get together anyway. So we spent that time to took stock of what we had, what were we familiar with, what tools we knew best, and then we pivoted. We were able to reduce complexity of the solution. Instead of inspector scanning and parsing the results and a long feedback loop to developers, we had chose to implement it in a CI/CD pipeline in GitLab using Trivy, which is the default container scanning solution for GitLab. Instead of complex business logic in EventBridge, Lambdas, and various Amazon services, we wrote some basic scripts in Ruby to do that parsing and alerting when vulnerabilities were found. The audit came and went with no findings, and we celebrated. We said, this is great. We're done. In the months that followed, our FedRAMP contact felt we were doing a great job. We communicated our vulnerabilities. Uh, we talked about patching. We discussed any deviations we needed. Done deal. Uh, not quite, actually. It was functional, but that was really about it. The team wasn't quite happy with the solution. The three of us that worked on it continued to advocate for improving the system. We wanted notifications to be less annoying and more actionable. We wanted implementation of scanning to be more user-friendly, so we didn't need to be the gatekeepers of the system. Since the audit, we've been slowly iterating on it with new lessons learned from day-to-day usage of the solution. But we also used new features of services introduced by Amazon. Over a year later, the process still isn't really where we want to be. We want to use things like Inspector in CI/CD, which was announced recently in conjunction with Security Hub, things like that. So how can we justify this to our leadership? It can definitely be hard to, go to your manager and say, that project I delivered 6 months ago? Well, it's terrible, um, and I want to redo it. You need to read the room, of course, but framing the work you want to do as an improvement can really help quantify the results. Say something like, this will save the team 3 labor hours per week of manually sorting through vulnerabilities. Or this will reduce the false positive rates that our compliance team has to work through and explain to our auditors. As a leader, you should be welcoming these changes with open arms, especially if it's clear that the team's not happy with the original result. I truly believe engineers have a great idea of what's important to work on. As we saw in the last story, asking your team what's the biggest fire can really be telling. If they all bring up a project you delivered last year, then perhaps you should be making space for them to work on it instead of delivering another feature. It's really easy as an engineer or leader to look at the project and declare it's done, especially when you have a clear finish line, such as the audit in our case. But just because you cross the finish line, it doesn't mean you have to be done. All right, I admit that last story is still a bit of a work in progress, but I think it beautifully demonstrates the last point I want to make. The theme is the concept of good enough. You have to know what your personal level of quality you want to aim for is. When are you happy with the product? I'm a believer that everyone should build off of each other to increase the end quality of the deliverable. But understand that your version of good enough won't be your teammate's version of good enough. Make your case with evidence and let your teammate do the same, and then have a discussion about it. Your team will also have the concept of a quality level that they strive and deliver. There should be frequent conversations about it as a team. Constantly adjust based on the situation at hand. Situation might call for an earlier delivery date, so maybe your level of quality is lower. Financial limitations may restrict you in what you want to do. Finally, and we hit on this one already, but don't limit yourself to the old way. Be willing to consider what starting from scratch might look like. Even if you don't do it and you just continue to iterate, thinking about what you would change if you implemented that controller a different way today and didn't have past decisions stuck in your mind can be really, really telling for how you implement things in the future. All right, time for a wrap up. Um, we covered 3 scenarios today, but what can you do after you leave here? I think about these experiences often. I typically come to the conclusion that there are a couple of things we can do ourselves and bring back to our team. The first one is super easy, but we don't do a very good job at it. It's communicate. Talk to each other. Tell your coworker about that cool new Kubernetes tool you came across on Hacker News the other day. Ask your team as a leader what passion projects they're working on. How do they feel about the status of a project? Talk about the anxiety spike that you get when you have that page when a component breaks and you don't want to work on it because of a pile of tech debt that you need to untangle to troubleshoot it. Next, always learn. Keep learning. It doesn't have to be technical either. I spent just as much time learning about science communication, organizational strategy, leadership techniques, things like that. Whatever you're interested in. It helps you grow professionally, but it also keeps your mind sharp when you're working on other things. Keep evolving, both internally and externally. So toy with how you might scale that data tier if your org lands a huge customer and you need to scale 10x. Also adjust and try new ways of solving problems. If you typically start on a certain part of the stack when debugging, try a different angle next time. And finally, this is probably the most important one. Be human. Your team is filled with humans. Your boss is a human. You're a human. We all make mistakes. We don't know everything. You need to be kind to yourself and others. All of these suggestions are things you don't need to be an expert to do. They're just things that you need to practice to keep improving on. You should be encouraging others to you work with to do the same. Once you and the people you work with sync to a good rhythm, that's when you really start excelling and working as a high performing team. And that's a wrap. Thank you everyone for listening in and have a wonderful day.